Now, John told me not to say too much about it. He said, y'all were here to see some gardens, and not to hear me talk all about his past. But John is an increasingly rare breed, I think, a trained botanist and horticulturist. We kind of put barriers in between those a lot of times in the education system now, and it's unfortunate because the basis for horticulture is botany, and botany, if you're not growing the plants for any reason, I don't know if it's what the purpose is. So John was the botanist for the Royal Botanic Society at Wisley before coming to the U.S. as curator of the St. Louis Botanic Gardens. So started off with two of the world great botanic gardens. After leaving St. Louis Botanic Garden, John ran the horticulture for Wayside Gardens with Park Seed. I'm sure many of us have many plants in our gardens from that were carefully selected by John to be in Wayside. And then up to Clem's Song Sparrow Garden, which those of you who come to our gala may have plants from Clem's in our catalog, because they're very generous for us every year with the catalog. And then working with the Gardens Alive group on their horticulture. So really has had a great career both in public horticulture and the nursery industry, and has a really fantastic sense of both what's a great garden plant and what's what people might be actually interested in. And a lot of that is culled from visiting these fantastic gardens all over the world. So without any more, please help me welcome John Elsley.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Mark and Chris, for those kind words of introduction. Over generous, I guess. But may I say what a great pleasure it is for myself and my wife Billy to visit you today. We had a wonderful tour around the garden. Although I was here actually 2 years ago, I didn't leave the greenhouses down there with Denny Warner, so I really didn't see much of the garden. But I was extremely impressed at what you've done recently, and I think the highlight to me was the new Asian garden, and the bathhouse, of course, was quite outstanding. The staff are to be congratulated on that. So keep up the great work, and may I thank you all for coming this evening, because I'm sure you had some probably better things to do, although there's not much on television, I think, these days. Anyhow, for nearly 60 years, visiting gardens has always been an important element in both my personal and professional life. During this period, be it a single or multiple visits to the same garden over an extended period of time, my botanical and horticultural interests have continued to be enriched, together with a developing interest in the evolution of the English ornamental garden. Established gardens are forever changing, while an ever-expanding palette of more recently created gardens and landscapes expose visitors to current trends and styles. My objective this evening is to present a widely diverse selection of gardens that, for various reasons, have proved personally inspirational. If any of you were to compile your own list, I am certain there would be some choices that we would commonly share, and I trust being reminded of these gardens tonight will recall many happy memories. And finally, most of the selected gardens this evening are frequently open to visitors, although a few are likely to be open on a more restricted basis. So if we could
just press the bottom button.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. Let's just. Okay. Is that all right? Can you all? Yes. Wait. Fine. Thank you. This small pond garden at Hampton Court Palace is which is just west of London, is representative of the first European ornamental garden style, which arose during the 16th century. In England, it was the Tudor period. It was really the first, I think, of the ornamental garden styles in Europe. And it was a formal in nature and very inward looking. Its influence was certainly not originally from Britain, but especially from France. Here we go. This Hett-Loo Palace in Holland, this is a restored 17th century Dutch Baroque William and Mary garden. Has, again, strong French influence and was considered at the time the Versailles of Holland. Inward looking again, one has water, one has plants, and one has sculpture. And the garden itself could be thought of as being tucked into the woods. Now, from the earliest times, of course, Holland is noted for its horticultural industry and a great commercial tradition. And here at the Hortus Bulborum in Lissa, one has an incredible little garden which was started in 1924 specifically for the conservation of historic bulb varieties. Bulbs have been grown in Holland really since the 16th century, when of course one had, and then in the 1600s, one had the tulipomania situation develop. In this garden, there are approximately 400 varieties grown, 2,600 species of tulips, of which 90% are no longer in the trade. It is, of course, basically a wonderful gene pool for breeding. Walking around that, one gets the feeling, frankly, of, in fact, one's walking around similar to what some of the world's best art galleries. And, of course, the Keukenhof Gardens are worldwide famous and are the display gardens of the Dutch bulb industry. They originally were opened about 1949 or 1950 and are planted in a natural woodland setting. And often the plants are planted in a very imaginative way, as one sees, of course, here in this so-called river of scillas. This idea has spread, throughout the world in many ways. And one garden in the United States that really has impressed me with the use of bulbs is the Olbrich Botanical Gardens in Madison, Wisconsin. And throughout the year, in fact, they have outstanding, innovative ornamental displays. Again, they have just outside the main gate a river of scillas, and the plant is also used in spectacular fashion in the formal setting here, with the early flowering selection of Cornus Mass, one called Golden Glory, very upright habit. It was just a most beautiful combination. So that's Olbrich Botanical Gardens in Madison, Wisconsin. Two other gardens that were created in the 20th century, but in a formal 17th century French style. One of them is the Villa Ephrussi de Rothschild at Cap Jean Ferrat and the French Riviera. It was opened really started construction in around 1912, and is a seaside villa of Beatrice de Rothschild. It's a most superbly located garden overlooking the Mediterranean, and it's beautifully maintained, one of the best maintained gardens that I've seen. And not only do you get that very formal presentation seen from the house, but there were also a number of very, very fine themed gardens and a wide range of plants. And of course, we come back to the United States and the Longwood Gardens at Kennett Square, over 1,000 acres, and is one of the United States premier display gardens, opened in 1906 and designed and created by Pierre Dupont. The particularly French aspect of the garden, I think, is the fantastic water fountain garden. And of course, not only that, there are superb indoor and outdoor displays and theme gardens, and certainly a garden worth visiting at any time of the year. Now, in addition to the ornamental gardens, it's important to realize the scientific aspect of gardening and botany was the cause of several very important historical gardens. Oxford Botanic Garden here in England is Britain's oldest botanic garden and was originally called a physic garden, and was opened in 1621. It's a beautiful location by the River Cherwell, and a magnificent Magdalen College chapel tower as a background to the main entrance. It today houses a most comprehensive collection, both of interest to botanists and gardeners, and is again located, I think I mentioned, on the River Cherwell. Many of you will, of course, know the garden if you watch the public television series of Inspector Morse and Inspector Lindley. It's really nice that they, use that on quite a number of occasions, actually. And the Uppsala University Botanic Garden in Sweden, 1655, is the oldest in Sweden, and I think of any botanic garden, again, beautifully maintained. 1741, Carl Linnaeus became the head of the garden, and of course developed there his binomial classification system. The order beds that we're looking at contain something like 13,000 different species, and as I say, a beautifully maintained garden, one I shall never forget. Beautiful city, University City, Uppsala. And of course the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in Richmond in Surrey, 1759, is the world's most famous botanical garden, and in 2003 became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In true European tradition, the botanical garden, namely an institute for research, display, and education. And Kew has had a profound influence on the world of plants in general, and particularly economic plants. One thinks of the rubber industry in Malaysia, which is very, very important in the mid-20th century, and before that, they brought the plants to Kew from South America, where the rubber plant is native, propagated them, and then sent them on to Malaysia, Singapore. It's interesting also that you think of the British Empire, when Britain took over a country or colonized it. Initially they would establish a system of law and order, but very high on the list was to establish a botanical garden. So most of the old British Empire countries now have interesting botanical gardens. Some magnificent buildings at Kew. One has Decimus Burton's fantastic palm house, which we see here, and Kew Palace, which was built in 1631, and in the mid-1950s they developed this, what they call the Queen's Garden there, a formal garden representative of what may well have been there or similar in the 1600s. And Kew boasts the world's largest living plant collection, over 30,000 species, and really one of the plants that, of course, is the they consider really important to them is the Victoria Lily Amazonica, Victoria Amazonica, which of course is there cultivated purely as a greenhouse plant. We move now to the 18th century and the so-called English landscape garden, and which was in great contrast to the more formal gardens of the previous 2 centuries. And the interesting thing is that the English landscape garden was in fact one of the only two English original contributions to the visual arts. The other one actually was perpendicular Gothic architecture. Think of the Houses of Parliament in London. Probably one of the most important, if not the most important of these gardens is at Rousham House in Oxfordshire, and is probably the least known of them. It was William Kent that designed and laid this garden out between 1731 and 41. Today, the garden is still in private ownership of the same family, the Dormer family, since its inception. Very classical features, of course, were included in these gardens, and they resulted really from the wealthy that used to go to Europe on the so-called Grand Tour, looking at the arts in France, Italy, and Austria and such countries. Just two pieces there. Sorry, I can go back again a moment. This is the arcade, and as you walk around Rousham, it certainly used to be, and I don't think there still is. There's no tea room or gift shop or anything else like that. It's just absolutely, you feel as though you've taken back centuries. This is the arcade, or the Praenesti as it's called, and this is one of the very fine sculptures in the garden. This is by Schumacher, the lion and the horse. And if it was a slightly larger photograph of that, it's nice how the surrounding countryside is literally part of the garden. The garden's brought in with as you look at a piece of sculpture like that, for example. And I think one of the finest situated gardens in England is Powis Castle on the English-Welsh border, a most spectacular setting looking towards the River Severn Valley. The castle itself, parts of it date back to the 13th century, and the garden is being developed on a series of terraces. Like this, you'll see them across here. A number of these in the 1950s and 60s were planted up with some absolutely spectacular perennial displays under the guidance of Graham Stewart Thomas, who was then in his early years as the Gardens Director of the National Trust. I'll mention him a little later. And the age of this garden is beautifully illustrated by these clipped yew hedges here, which are now over 350 years old. It's a spectacular garden, and I don't know of a garden that's probably in any better situated, in a better location than Powis. Probably the most famous of these 18th century landscape gardens is Stourhead in Wiltshire. It's really an icon of garden taste and was developed by Henry Hoare, who was a member of an extremely wealthy banking family. It was developed in the mid-1700s and was enriched by superb ornamental buildings. One has here the Greek Pantheon, adjacent to the Gothic English cottage. Somehow that works. Let's see, this is the grotto overlooking the lake, and of course you know, within the grotto, one has the nymph. It's an incredible place. And then also the two temples of Flora, and on the hillside the Temple of Apollo. Beautiful bridge, stone bridge here. It's a garden, if you haven't visited, I put it in my top 5 in Britain to visit. I feel that what we see there today is probably, apart from the buildings and that, probably more spectacular than when it was originally constructed, in all honesty. This style of gardening, of course, was undertaken in the United States, and at Middleton Place, just outside of Charleston, and I'm sure many of you know it, had a very, very strong English influence. It was a southern, 18th century southern plantation, and is the oldest landscape estate in North America. The terraced lawns and the 2 butterfly lakes at the bottom overlook the Ashley River. Andre Michaud, 1786, introduced the earliest camellia introductions into the country, and they were planted actually here at Middleton Place. And of course, when you go to Middleton, one has to look at the superb 1,000-year-old live oak, Quercus virginiana. You almost go there to worship that tree. Chatsworth House, the home of the Dukes of Bedfordshire, the garden was started in the early 18th century and continues to be developed today by the present Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. It incorporates several garden styles on a vast scale. In the 18th century, Lancelot Capability Brown had some influence on the estate, but the real person that had the biggest influence, I think, was Joseph Paxton, of course, who designed the Crystal Palace in London for the 1850 exhibition. And amongst the buildings that still exist that Paxton designed was this wall greenhouse, which was used for growing largely camellias, and which they still are today. They're not hardy in that part of England particularly. And the superb water features. Oh, beg your pardon, I need to go forward, that's right. The Emperor Fountain here, which was designed for a visit to Chatsworth by the Emperor of the Tsar of Russia. It was constructed and all working, but the guy never turned up. So it's an interesting story. And there's the Cascade waterfall, quite spectacular. There used to be an enormous greenhouse. You think back to Decimus Burton's Palm House at Kew. It was on that scale, but that was, I think, was pulled down in the early 1950s. It was in that greenhouse, actually, the first Victoria Amazonica was grown and flowered in the United Kingdom. We think of Chatsworth in a sense that it had an enormous effect on the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis. Henry Shaw, who was born in 1800 and died in 1889, came to the United States as a young man in his late teens and lived in Sheffield. His father made cutlery there, and he came to the United States to New Orleans and up the river and established the Missouri Botanical Garden in 1840. He made a fortune with the settlers going west, but the influence of Chatsworth was significant on him. He used to visit the gardens there, and I think when he came to the United States, his ambition was to establish his own garden. And the result is the Missouri Botanical Garden. And this is Henry Shaw's Tower Grove House here, and this is the old main herbarium building. It's since been replaced with another brand new building as the gardens expanded. Missouri Botanical Gardens is the oldest continually operating garden in the United States, and again in the European tradition, very active research program, display, and education. Again, we see the garden, one of the major plant groups that the garden's been noted for over the years, the water lilies. And again, we see the Victoria Amazonica lily there. It's not hardy in St. Louis. It's raised as seed in the spring, over winter and into spring, then planted out for a summer effect. And of course, one sees the great building of the climatron. The garden really contains quite a number of theme gardens now. One that I was particularly excited about was the English Woodland Garden, which we did as the bicentennial project in 1976. Woodland gardening has become more and more popular, I think, over the last 20 to 30 years. And again, I think you should think of the Missouri Botanical Garden really as a garden for all seasons. The Japanese garden, which is about 16 acres now, is truly, a setting, as you see there, of two totally contrasting seasons, and as beautiful in winter as it is in spring. If I was to pick out a woodland garden that's had a big effect on myself, I always enjoyed visiting it, is the Savill Gardens in Windsor Great Park. It's magnificent, 35 acres, and a fantastic collection of mature, large trees, beech and oak and sweet chestnut particularly. It was started by Sir Eric Savill, 1932, and consists of some absolutely wonderful glades and vistas. You see at the bottom a collection of Asiatic plants, primulas, hostas, and of course the blue-flowered Echinopsis grandis. And in another glade, that wonderful edging plant, which is Trillium grandiflorum, used as an edging plant. It's quite spectacular. So Windsor Great Park, and I haven't been there for a number of years now, but I understand it's still as interesting and is really a fine collection fine collection to see. A 17th century walking garden is to be seen in Japan at the Ritsurin Park in Takamatsu. And there again, there are some spectacular trees. The Japanese have a respect for all things natural, both living and inert, and a great respect for old age. Here you see at one nursery a 1,000-year-old Japanese maple, the bonsai. It was quite incredible. And then on the Ritsurin Park, it's a very ancient Japanese red pine, Pinus densiflora, on that side. But the idea of that walking garden is that you create the garden yourself as you walk around the central lake. I was fortunate enough to spend about 8 weeks in Kyoto, and the thing that really did surprise me were, in fact, the great range of design within the Japanese garden. The Heian Shrine, and most of these gardens were associated actually with temples. The Heian Shrine, these beautiful stepping stones originally were pillars for an old stone bridge, piers for it. And in reverence, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, they've been made into that wonderful stepping stone thing across this pond. The Ryoan-ji garden goes back to the 1500s. It's a temple garden and a meditation garden. You see the entire garden there, and it's in many ways an austere enclosure. There are just 15 stones and white gravel, and it's thought that they may represent islands within an ocean. Actually, you can count 15, but I was told that most people that understand the garden well know there are 16, so let me leave that with you. The Sanbo-in, again another temple, Kyoto, dates back to the 1500s, about an acre, water, stone, and sheared or pruned plants, and indicating man's control over nature. And it was beautifully manicured, and was the site of many viewing parties over the centuries. Incredible maintenance. I don't think there was a leaf out of place. The Entsu-ji garden, late 17th century viewing garden again, largely of moss and very low stones. It's a two-dimensional garden. You look at it and you get the horizontal effect with the clipped hedge and the vertical effect with the bare stems of Cryptomeria japonica, so your eyes are going, both ways. And it classically shows the art of the borrowed landscape. Mount Hiei is in the background, and frankly is obviously part of that whole garden scene. The Shugakuin Riku, mid-17th century, it's a royal villa. It's 12 acres in size and was the location for the emperors to hold tea parties. It's on 3 levels. The actual levels themselves are divided by rice paddies. And from the top level, as we see here, spectacular mountain views. So again, that whole the importance of borrowed landscape was very real element within these gardens. And the Saiho-ji, or the Kokadera boss temple, was a very intimate and unique effect. Its ancient woodland was totally carpeted with mosses, something like 20 to 30 different varieties, and there are probably many more. But it was just a wonderful feeling. It's a small garden, and one that I shall certainly never forget. Now, coming to the 20th century gardens and landscapes, starting off with several arboretums. This is Sheffield Park in Sussex, early 1900s. Mass lakeside plantings imposed on an 18th century landscape. It was probably in fact Capability Brown that designed some of these lakes, evidently. And Sheffield Park is an astonishing collection of trees and shrubs, and you see a great contrast of forms and foliage. And I think I know of no better garden that I've seen where reflection plays such an important part of the lakes, with the trees at various times of the year. Great garden for colour. Another one there, the different coloured foliage of the conifers and the Japanese maples, and a strategically placed pampas grass really highlights that particular view. On a much, much smaller scale, the Trompenberg Arboretum is situated right in the middle of Rotterdam, only 12 acres, and was the personal garden of James Manhoey Smith. Extensive collection of trees and shrubs, which have recently, or had recently, probably 20 years ago now, been enhanced by more perennial plantings. But that literally is in the middle of a huge Dutch city, Trompenberg Arboretum. Several plants have been selected from there and, see the cultivar Trompenberg. Spring Grove Cemetery and Arboretum in Cincinnati is, I think, one of North America's most finest man-made landscapes. Started in the 1850s by Adolf Strauch, a German landscape architect, and again an outstanding selection of trees, and trees particularly suitable for the Midwest, and many, many fine funerary statues. It truly is a garden for all seasons. And I remember for many years when I visited it, there's the national champion, Yellowwood was there, but it's since, it's now deceased. But a beautiful, beautiful landscape. Old Westbury Gardens on Long Island is a superb example of a 20th century English estate garden, developed by Margarita Grace Phipps, and she had constructed this English Georgian mansion. The garden consists of a number of beautiful vistas going away from the house, and also some very, very fine and innovative seasonal plantings. The trees, many of them were grown from nurseries over the other side of Long Island Sound in Connecticut, and were brought across to this garden and some of the neighbouring private estate gardens of the time, like, for example, planting fields. The wall garden, of course, so common to many of the English estate gardens, it is beautiful at various seasons. You get a spring effect there, and then you get the same garden in the fall, beautifully maintained, by the way. And Gravetye Manor in England, the home of William Robinson, the noted author and influential gardener, late 19th and early 20th century. It was William Robinson that really expanded the naturalistic form of gardening versus the more formal styles of the Victorian period, particularly some of the bedding schemes, which he referred to as in-out gardening. You'd take the bulbs out in late spring and then put the summer bedding in, geraniums and that sort of thing. There's some beautiful woodlands surrounding the place, and surrounding the old manor house, which today is a very exclusive country hotel. Gertrude Jekyll was one of his friends, as was Louisa King, an American lady from Alma, Michigan, who wrote several very important early books on perennial gardening in the United States. And she was also one of the 2 or 3 founding members of the Garden Clubs of America. Her books are well worth reading even today. Incidentally, as I say, it's a private country hotel now, Gravetye. It's incredibly expensive to stay there, but if you want to see the gardens, you can equally have a pretty expensive afternoon tea, but it's worth it to see the gardens. Hett-Loo Manor is probably the most influential English garden of the 20th century. It was developed from 1907 by Major Lawrence Johnson, who was an American. His mother lived there in the village. And it is absolutely a feast of plants and design. Formal vistas of hornbeam and the Italianate pruned hornbeam hedges there, forming what the pleached stilt garden, as it's called. There are a series of small themed gardens, which you this is the beautiful white garden here, dominated in early throughout the summer with the rose Grusenaken. And the little cottage, as you might say, borrowed landscape, has nothing to do with the garden. That's just a cottage in the village, but it really makes that particular scene. And then the red border really creates a rather smooth, calming effect as you walk through it, with the dark background of the hedges and the reds and the oranges. It just a magnificent, very important garden. Sissinghurst Castle, many of you will know about, and of course have been there. It was the home of created by Victoria Sackville West, who was the gardener, and Harold Nicholson, her husband. They were both authors, and they were greatly influenced by Hidcote. And the old ruined castle it was developed really as a prison for several centuries, and again a series of spectacular small gardens with a theme, a particular colour theme. One sees here the rondel, which is the kind of based on the structure of the oast houses in Kent, and for the drying of the hops, and that's kind of the base of an oast house. The well-known White Garden, and the Old Rose Garden, spectacularly enhanced by the selection of superb perennials. And it's just wonderful over the years how that garden has been maintained, considering the number of visitors that it receives. Both Hidcote and Sissinghurst were largely responsible and a great influence for this garden. Hoenatahi, which I think I pronounced correctly, just outside of Christchurch in New Zealand. It's in a dramatic setting overlooking Lyttelton Harbour. It was developed by the noted New Zealand architect Sir Miles Warren. The plants, the design and the style just create a place of superb quality. That's the only way I think you can describe that garden. Strict architectural lines have been created, and cross-axes and areas with informal plantings. And also the garden is enhanced in places by some superb New Zealand sculptures. Still, of course, in the 20th century, this is a garden in the spectacular setting of the Vale of Taunton, Hester-ku. It was developed 1903 by Gertrude Jekyll and her partner Edwin Lutyens. He was the architect, she was the plantsman. And here we're looking over the sunken, it's called the Great Platte here, and the strong architecture is softened by Gertrude Jekyll's bold, simple planting, which includes many of her favourite plants. It was in 1973 the local county fire department took over the house. The gardens were in a pretty poor state then, and unbelievably they found Gertrude Jekyll's original planting plans nailed to the back of the potting shed door. So that's been just most beautifully reconstructed as it was in those days with her plants. So Hester-ku, again, a most beautiful setting overlooking the Vale of Taunton. Strong architectural structures you see there. Centranthus in the wall, seeding itself naturally. Great use of colour. And Barrington Court, another garden in the county county of Somerset, not too far actually from Hesticombe, Barrington Court. Again, significant influence in the planting by Gertrude Jekyll. This is typical of an English herbaceous border. You don't see many of them these days. They are usually dug up every 3 to 4 years and replanted. And you would get at that border, there's a narrow passage at the back against the wall, so you would go in there to stake plants, etc. And there's two magnificent colour borders at Barrington Court. The red border here, and look how the old calf pens here form a most rural, rustic effect as a background. Beautifully designed and created. And there's again the opposite side of the grass path there, the yellow border. And again, Gertrude Jekyll, of course, was a great fan of rural country arts and crafts. So that was just a perfect setting for that particular planting. Kinghtshayes Court in Devon, comparatively recent garden, started in the 1950s by Sir John and Lady Heathcote Amory, and really today I think embodies the best of modern gardening. The terrace beside the house and a series of unique spaces created by bold yew hedges. Many of these hedges, for example, here you've got, which goes here and then this way, you have a fox here, and you've got the hounds chasing it across the top of the hedge. Totally, very interesting garden. The pool garden at Kinghtshayes, two quite spectacular plants: the Pyracilicifolia pendula, the weeping pear, and the Acer Pseudoplatanus brilliantissimum. Earlier in the year, that would be almost shrimp pink foliage. Very small area, but everything is just, perfectly placed. Lady Heathcote Amory, after her husband's death, developed a woodland garden, which she never liked being called a woodland garden, but more so a garden in the woods. Graham Stuart Thomas, who 1909 to 2003 was probably the most influential ornamental horticulturist in Britain, certainly in the second half of the 20th century and probably over the 20th century. Several people describe him as such in his obituaries. He was a personal friend and mentor, had great experience in the nursery industry as a gardener and as an artist, and was the author of 21 original books. I mean, there was no plagiarization with Graham at all. He was the first National Trust Gardens advisor and had a significant effect on many of England's finest gardens today that are in control of the National Trust, that do just an outstanding job with their training scheme for head gardeners and the maintenance of these, national treasures. He was a great admirer of Gertrude Jekyll and had just after he graduated from the Cambridge Botanic Garden, visited her, cycled down to visit her in Sussex, and spent an afternoon with her. And I have a wonderful recording that the BBC made with him of that experience. Probably Graham's masterpiece is the Old Rose Garden. In fact, there are now 2 of them at Modestmont Abbey in Hampshire, developed in the wall garden of that particular house. It contains a superb collection of pre-1900 shrub roses and the best of modern perennials, and which of course extend the display of a number of the roses which are one-time bloomers. Graham was a man of great precision and said that the third Friday in June was the day you should always visit Mottersman if you have a chance, specifically to that day. But you know, if you go around that time, it's still fantastic. And the roses, interestingly, are grown there, and as he always used to say, roses should not be thought of as roses, but as flowering shrubs, and grown as flowering shrubs. He had a superb personal garden, very, very small, near Woking, and he maintained it by himself really until just before his death. Quarter of an acre, no more than that, but spectacular in its all year round interest. This was the front garden a few years before he died in December. You see the importance of, you know, flowers and foliage particularly, and bark in some cases. You've got one of the red-stemmed Cornus here, Cornus alba, probably Sibirica. And his back garden was equally just the most beautiful. Everything is somehow in the right position. It was just a joy to visit that garden and to hear about the various plants and their histories. He was, it's interesting because that garden has probably been dismantled now. And it's interesting to note, of course, you know, it's just the way things are, that so many good, small, private gardens just die with their owners. And, you know, there's nothing the matter with that, but the more that people can write and talk about their own gardens, I think it's very, very important for others to learn. Graham had a great influence in the early days with David Austin as he started his breeding of the English roses. And really, these were a group of, the first original group of new roses for over a century. They combined the form and fragrance of the old roses with the repeat blooming and expanded colour range of some of the modern roses. David developed an outstanding, his family, display gardens quite near Birmingham, actually, the Midlands of England. And the gardens are enhanced by some beautiful pieces of sculpture that were done by his wife, Pat. Well, she's since, you know, passed away a number of years ago now. And I understand, hopefully I should be able to see these gardens again this July, because I'm just told they are quite stunning. And if it's the right day, the fragrance is just unbelievable there. Sculpture, I think, is very important, is an important feature of even modern gardens. And a few examples that have always impressed me. This is the Chicago Botanic Garden, quite close to the entrance. A piece of sculpture by William and David Turner, a bronze, installed in 1988 at Canada Geese. It's in a superb location, and I think particularly as you see in winter here, with the Salix alba in the background, and snow, of course, and cold in Chicago, but that is really brings out the importance, particularly at that time of the year. The Atlanta Botanic Garden is interesting in that they made a point of displaying regularly changing sculpture exhibits. And in 2009, when I visited, there was a superb collection of Henry Moore sculptures. This is one that they actually, I think, put in wonderful in the carnivorous bog garden in the Atlanta Botanic Garden. As you look through that, you see the skyline of the city. The U.S. National Arboretum in Washington, D.C., these 22 columns originally were on the east portico of the U.S. Capitol. and then that was changed, and they just were put in oblivion in some storage, in the back somewhere in Washington. Nobody really knew of their existence. In 1988, Russell Page, the noted English landscape designer, located them on this particular site and designed a reflection pool. And I think you'll agree, it's just a most impressive reflection effect, and I think adds considerably to the National Arboretum itself. The Donald Kendall Sculpture Garden in Purchase, New York, not far from downtown New York, in Purchase, is one of the most impressive gardens I think I've ever visited. And it was in the morning, got there about 10:30, and it was drizzling and raining, but the effect was absolutely stunning. This was a garden created again between 1980 and 85 by Russell Page, and he developed a 168-acre park-like landscape and incorporating 45 magnificent sculptures, modern sculptures, that belonged to the collection of Donald Kendall, who at that time was the chairman of the PepsiCo company. And the idea was that the garden, or should I say the landscape, signified the vision of the company, one of stability, creativity, and experimentation. And not only were the sculptures installed, but the planting around the number of them was quite spectacular. You see here the effect of a copper beech hedge, like form a little amphitheatre there, and the Ophiopogon black stem plant, forming a superb base for that piece of sculpture. Go to visit that garden if you get a chance. I think it's one of the great gardens of North America. And much closer to home, of course, is Brookgreen Gardens at Murrells Inlet, just down the coast, from just south of Myrtle Beach. I think it's one of the best kept secrets of American gardens, actually. Many people just don't know it, or certainly haven't been there. And it was the first public sculpture garden in North America. There's about 1,400 modern figurative American sculptures, and I like many of them. Billy and we particularly liked this particular one called Long, Long Thoughts, by it's still alive, a sculptor from Philadelphia, Charles Parks. I was there about 6 weeks ago, and they're making a lot of changes, but I think from what I could see, the reciting a number of these sculptures, I think, was greatly enhanced them, from when I'd been there probably 25 years ago originally. Now, a little bit about native plant gardens, and I shall never forget visiting South Africa on 2 occasions, and of course this spectacular scenery and native flora. Look, Cape Town is a most beautifully located city in the lee of Table Mountain, and the Cape Peninsula itself, which is not a very, very large area, has an 80% plus endemic flora, the highest in the world. In other words, the plants there grow naturally nowhere else. Of course, you've got the Indian Ocean on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other. The main botanical garden there is actually at Kirstenbosch in the lee of Table Mountain. 1,300 acres, basically all native plants, and very little landscaping done, but it's just a spectacular location. And the National Botanic Gardens is an organisation there, and Kirstenbosch is the largest of them, but they have 6 other satellite gardens in different parts of South Africa, where of course the native flora differs. And the Karoo Gardens here of course concentrates particularly on the native succulents. It's an experience again that I shall never forget. If we ever get a chance of visiting South Africa, it's an amazing experience. This was, I think, the most impressive garden, home garden, a personal garden that I saw. It's Brenthurst in Johannesburg. It was developed in 1904 by the South African landscape architect Joanne Pym. Again, a series of gardens for Harry and Bridget Oppenheimer. About 45 acres of them there. You see the beautiful purple jacaranda trees here. And the piece of sculpture there was by Pierre Renoir, Venus. And that's an original. I mean, it's you don't see that sort of sculpture in many gardens. But it was just a beautifully laid out landscape. You could just sit on the porch and overlook that. In the grounds of Brenthurst is this magnificent library, which contains the world's finest collection of Afrikaner folk art and literature particularly. Coming back nearer home, the Desert Botanical Garden at Phoenix is really my only experience of seeing a desert garden in this country, in a natural setting, and it's one of the most comprehensive collections of the United States Southwestern desert flora. Some 1,300, again, species of cacti are there. It was just fascinating for me. As a kid, I used to collect, as many kids do in England that are interested in gardening, cacti and succulents, of course, grown in greenhouses. But to see, really the first time I'd seen them in the wild was an exciting experience. The Huntington Library and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California, north of LA. 15-acre desert garden is the largest desert plant collection outside the natural deserts in the world, and is superbly laid out. The estate itself is about 200 acres, and a spectacular series of themed gardens. And of course, when you go there, you've got to visit the library, but particularly as a collection of art. And there you'll see the Blue Boy, the original, probably the most famous painting in the world, or known by most people. And the garden, as I say, a series of beautiful vistas looking towards the San Gabriel Mountains in the distance. The Livingstonia palms there, and highlighted by a collection of 17th century Italian marble statues. Beautifully maintained garden and full, just again, full of interest and well worth a visit. The garden, I was only able to spend half an hour seeing it, but it's one I would love to go back to, and on the Italian-French border is the Mortola Gardens, or as they're known, the Hanbury Gardens. 45 acres, developed by the Englishman Sir Thomas Hanbury. and occupy the entire Cape of Mortola, going right sheer down to the Mediterranean, and a superb collection along those cliffs of native species with some tropical exotics. The garden and house suffered serious damage during the Second World War. 1960 it was sold to the Italian state, and in 1987 was entrusted to Genoa University, who have done a remarkable job in bringing the gardens together in superb condition. As I say, very brief, I had a flight to catch, but at least I saw it, and it's certainly a place that I would love to go back to. And another specialist garden that I enjoyed was the Fairchild Tropical Garden in Coral Gables, developed in 1938 for David Fairchild, who was an eminent botanical explorer. And it's a showcase for tropical plants in a natural environment. Many native palms. There are 400 plus species of palms, 200 different cycads, and many tropical fruits. It was, again, most unusual, and I hadn't seen a garden like it at all. Quickly, we'll go back to New Zealand, because I think many of you, some of you I'm sure have visited, but I would strongly, if you get a chance of going, do so. Not a wide range of gardens, but some very good ones. This is Elsley, just outside of Auckland, the home of Bev McConnell. And she is a TV personality, and she does a lot of writing and that sort of thing. Close to the ocean, very mild, and a wide range of natives, plus some tropicals and some temperate plants. Larnach Castle on the Otago Peninsula near Dunedin is the only castle in New Zealand, and is beautifully landscaped gardens with many, many endemic native New Zealand species. Here one sees the lancewood, Pseudopanax ferox, and beautifully mature specimens. And down on the South Island near Wyndham, it's very flat and very windy, but the Muriel and Bob Davison have developed this, what they call a country garden, in a very deep sheltered gully. Mass plantings of conifers, maples and perennials, very European flavour, and some very interesting water features. And the thing that really fascinated us was she's got great collections of tropical and exotic birds that fly around freely in the garden, and go to roost at night in their cages. But it was a beautiful garden. I think, not quite like Oentani, but it was, considering its location, it was very, very interesting. Now, finally, some influential 20th century theme gardens. I must put Wisley in here, the Royal Horticultural Society's gardens near Gulford in Surrey, west of London, where the best of British gardening is on display. It's a garden for all seasons, a series of feature and display gardens, beautiful rock garden and alpine meadow. And in the spring, these are all seedling Narcissus bulbocodiums. It's a sight to behold. A modern small demonstration garden, and the 7 acres lake showing beautiful fall colour. The Corvus albus iberica, gunnera, and the russet colours here of Taxodium disticum. It's a garden well worth visiting. And as I say, showing the best British garden. British gardening. The another themed garden, Cambridge University Botanic Garden, teaching and display, but it was the first major winter garden to be developed, and is still an outstanding site. This picture was taken in, I think, the second week in January a few years ago. You know what British winters can be like, many of you, and so hence, you know, to develop a winter garden was the obvious thing to do in many cases, and this was really the first. Another wonderful winter garden, and this has developed more since this photograph was taken, is at Anglesey Abbey, just very close, a few miles out of the city of Cambridge. Lord Fairhaven's home, some magnificent trees also, and various themed gardens. As I say, the winter garden is outstanding. Betula with birches with their trunks, the begonias and snowdrops particularly, the garden's famous for. And I love this parterre garden because it's a spectacular, it's spectacular in its seasonal bedding. In the spring, you have the hyacinths, and you can imagine the fragrance of that garden. And then they're taken out, and then the dahlias follow for the summer display. And again, excellent use of colour. And very close to Cambridge, I think most people miss this, is the Cambridge American Cemetery at Madingley. It's in a spectacular location. It overlooks the city of Cambridge, and they're all American servicemen that were killed, particularly in the Air Force going across to Europe. Most of the British air bases were situated here in East Anglia, and it's just a most beautiful, beautiful place. There is the chapel that you see here has a stained glass window for each of the states, and then of course all those that are buried in the cemetery are on this memorial wall. Don't miss that if you're in Cambridge. It's of great, of course, interest to Americans. And a number of nursery display gardens. I haven't put Juniper Level Botanical Garden in here because I think you're all pretty familiar with it. Tony, of course, has done an outstanding job there. But this is Beth Challow's garden in England. It's one of really, I guess, the earliest of the nursery display gardens. Beth is still alive. I think she's 93 now and still has some influence, I understand, on it. She was a brilliant plantswoman, a practical gardener, a great author. It's one of the finest late 20th century gardens, and the art of planting is to be seen here at its best. She introduced many lost perennials and old favourites, and this is the dry garden. This here was, when I first knew the garden, it was the parking lot, and never ever been watered. And it's in the driest part of England. My home was fairly close by, and 20 to 21 inches of rainfall only a year. Never watered. Great example. The Bressingham Gardens, the home of the late Alan and Adrian Bloom today, both gardeners, both authors, and both very, very good plantsmen. Alan lived to be just under a few weeks under 100 years old, and he was the major perennial authority and breeder really in the second half of the 20th century in England. He introduced many fine plants, developed what is called the island bed display method of displaying perennials, which were the higher ones in the centre of the bed kind of came lower towards the edge and required no staking. Some of those old traditional borders, staking was a very critical and of course very time-consuming and expensive thing to do. So the island bed system of growing these plants is just beautifully displayed here, here at Bressingham. And in contrast to his father's garden, this is Adrian's garden, Foggy Bottom, is a year-round display of colour, particularly of course in winter with the various shapes and colours of the conifers. It's superbly maintained still, and the garden very close actually to Beth Challow's garden near Colchester. Coming to the United States, this is Northwest Garden Nursery just outside of Eugene, Ernie and Marietta O'Byrne. And I think it's possibly my favourite small, should I say public garden. It's not open a lot, but they have a look. They sell plants at various times of the year, and just superb use of plants for their form and their colour. Just look at the corydalus here and the variegated leaf Hemerocallis. It's a garden at any time of the year is just, if you're in that part of Oregon, try to get to see it. It's truly magnificent. All the year, and of course they specialise particularly in their wonderful strains of hellebores, which they've bred for probably now 20 to 25 years. Northwind Perennial Farm in southern Wisconsin, the home and nursery of Roy Diblick, very innovative nurseryman, garden designer and plantsman. And his recent book on the perennial garden maintenance is well worth reading. His display gardens are very much in the natural style with a strong emphasis on Midwestern natives and grasses. Roy is a remarkable person in many ways. And finally, just two gardens I think are of particular note. And first of all is, and if you haven't been, I think it's one you must put on your bucket list, is Chanticleer, just outside of Philadelphia. 30 acres, and has been open to the public since 1993. It's one of America's certainly finest, most recent gardens, and it's superbly presented. It shows great imagination, both in its formal and informal plantings. There's very innovative use of colour, and I think the garden and the kind of main gardeners there, they have no fear of experimentation. And I think at Chanticleer you'll just see ideas and that you'll see nowhere else, I think, in this country. So put it, certainly if you haven't seen it, that is the so-called teacup garden. And the texture there is just a small garden, but superb, superb in its texture and colours. And finally, I guess my favourite garden of all, Billy and I get a great pleasure from our own personal garden in Greenwood. It's about an acre. It's 35 years old. It's very much in an urban location, less than half a mile from the downtown. And you'll see the kind of ideas that we've tried to put into it. The street, I'm standing on the street when I took that photograph. So, and of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, gardens are forever changing. And it's a garden for all seasons. Yes, we do get some snow. And the same photograph there, you'll see then here in summer. And again, I've tried to get combinations. And when I look at, for example, the various forms that I have of the native oak leaf hydrangea, I think it's probably one of my favourite 5 plants. There's some absolutely superb newer selections of it. The wonderful thing, it comes into flower now, it is at home, and will last, 4 to 6 weeks, and then even longer. You can even cut the dried flower heads. And I started a stumpery about 4 or so years ago, and that was actually the 2nd year of it. It's under a big magnolia in the back garden. Nothing else would grow under there, so I brought some soil in, and I kind of was fortunate enough to work with 2 grandchildren who lived down on Lake Murray near Columbia, and they provided me with a constant supply of magnificent stumps. Of course, I guess Prince Charles's stumpery in England is probably one of the most famous, modern stumperies. Anyhow, they were a great feature in Victorian gardens where ferns were cultivated to a great extent. And as I say, each of these stumps is a piece of sculpture, and it's a challenge to find out what will grow in such shaded conditions. Two references, which I think if you're interested in the history of gardens, and one particularly the World of Gardening is the first one, and the second one is focused much more on gardens of Britain and Ireland. The two probably best books, I think, on the subject. And as I say, they're on your list. So I hope those is giving you some idea, brought back some memories for you. And as I say, if you could make your own list, I'm sure you would include some of those. And people, the last time I gave this kind of talk to me about why didn't you include this, why didn't you include that? But there's just no better way of being inspired for one's own garden than to visit other gardens and, just get small ideas. Look, for example, here today at the development of that crevice garden for alpine plants, particularly those that, have got deep tap roots and want to get down but good drains. Things you can do on a much smaller scale than you see in, on a much bigger scale in some larger gardens. Thank you very much indeed. Comments, ideas, thoughts?
The heat was turned up twice. It looks like it might be unresponsive. Thanks for putting up with it. Any questions for John, not for the AC staff?
Yes.
How'd you happen to pick Greenlight, South Carolina?
Well, I'm one of those, should I say, fortunate people that has to earn a living. And I came to this country in 1972 and worked with Peter Rain at Missouri Botanical Garden, and then left there in 1980. A couple of years or so after Park Seed had bought Wayside Gardens. And I was kind of needed a change. Fundraising was not much fun after a while. I may as well open my own travel agency, I guess. But that was important at St. Louis at that time, and I much enjoyed it. I was offered a position with the Park Seed Company. They wanted someone with a knowledge of plants. They said they'd teach me business, and that's why I came to Greenwood. And have stayed ever since, and will continue, we hope, until we depart to the garden ourselves, sort of thing. It really is probably one of the, over the 35 years we've lived there, I think it's probably one of the best places in the United States to garden if you're interested in a wide range of plants. There's so many southern plants that will grow there, and of course many of the more northern stalwarts. It's a very nice climate as well. Why won't we move? Well, it's a wonderfully inexpensive. It's kind of a hidden secret. It's just about what it is, less than an hour's drive south of Greenville.
That's very close to due west, too.
It's very close to due west, yes. Yeah, where Presbyterian College is, yeah. It's, we really enjoy it, and it's nice to share the garden with people. We always say, if you want to come, come. If we're not here, we're not here. But you're sure not. People are welcome to come at any time of the year. Just walk around. And now I've got more time to work in the garden. It's, it's very pleasurable and, great learning experience. As you get older, as you know, you find you know less about the subject than you like to think, actually. The climate can be challenging. This is rain I hear here. That's one. We're very dry this year. So, it was I had to have irrigation. if you're going to grow that range of flowers. Yes?
What kind of trees were your stumps?
Well, that's interesting, because Prince Charles, of course, he has oak largely in his stumpery. I haven't seen it, but I got far superior stumps to him. They are cedar, or juniperus virginianum, so they'll outlive both of us. And, as I say, my two grandchildren find them in the woods around their home on Lake Murray. And they'll last for many, many years. If you've got some shade or something, you know, it's an interesting method of gardening. You know, I couldn't grow. I've developed a second stumper in the front garden under a very big Japanese maple. You know. And yes.
You had mentioned some of the newer cultivars of earthly hydrangeas that you were enjoying. Could you give us a few that you like?
Well, if I had to pick one, it would be Snow Queen that Bill Flemmer introduced from Princeton Nursery many years ago. Of the newer ones, I like Munchkin, which was bred in a reputedly dwarf. I've got it in the front garden. It's about that high now. I would hope it doesn't get any bigger. And what is the yellow Antonia? Yellow leaf. Little honey? Outstanding. I've got 2 specimens in the garden. The problem with little honey is it's not an easy part in the trade to grow. Basically, oak-leaf hydrangeas don't like growing in a pot. But once you do get them going, that's been I've heard that as an experience. Little honey is stunning. If I hadn't Snow Queen, that would be probably my favourite. There's one called Ruby Slippers, and it came from the department, USDA, at their Tennessee station in McMinnville. But I think they'll get taller than they say. I mean, but Munchkin is my favourite. I think if I had to pick those 3, there's probably not a bad one, you know. The British can't really grow the plant. They don't have warm enough summers for it. I can't recall that really growing well in any British garden. They may exist, I'm sure they exist, but they're not a thing. You know, we're blessed, and I think that's, you know, the way, wherever your garden is, just grow what you know will do well there. You're not going to grow everything. It's like moving from, you know, what do we say, Michigan or Illinois to Florida and wanting to grow your herbaceous stuff. It just doesn't happen. Yeah. Well, I appreciate your attention.